Hello, Liverpool fans. Welcome to the Liverpool Reaction, an American LFC podcast. Coach Ralph and I are excited to bring you this podcast. From games to players to club news, we cover everything LFC. You can find us on every platform and YouTube. Please take a second to follow or subscribe to the podcast. That way you know when the newest show is up. Thank you for listening, and now on to the show. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Liverpool Reaction, an American LFC podcast. I am one of your hosts, Salim, and I'm joined by my co-host, Coach Ralph. Coach, how are you?
Doing fine, doing great. In fact, Salim, and big hello to all the Liverpool fans out there who are listening.
Yeah, for sure. So today's topic is a little bit different. It is the top Liverpool signings, and Coach and I took some liberties to kind of approach this a little bit different. When Coach and I kind of decide on subjects, we kind of just put something out there, and we leave each other alone to just kind of put our own little spin on it and our own little the way we kind of look at it. So, Coach, you have a very unique look at your transfers, and because Coach's experience with Liverpool goes a lot farther and deeper than mine, especially in the early years, we are going to start there.
Correct. And I think the biggest thing when I was thinking about this subject, Salim, was just how much transfers. And I'm not just talking about Liverpool Football Club now. I'm talking about generally in the English game, how the whole concept of transfers has changed for the fans because if you're looking to go online these days, if you're looking at social media and the newspapers, the websites, everybody's speculating and they want big money signings. Like they tend to get excited about it, the fan bases, and I think that they look at it as kind of a quick fix for their team. And I'm not sure it's always quite been that way. Certainly not in my lifetime. And I think the first thing that I was thinking of when we think of Liverpool and transfers and everything was during the era of Bill Shankly and certainly the earlier part of Bob Paisley's reign, the roles that transfers had. And obviously there would be a certain amount of players that they might buy from rival teams. But I think one of the characteristics of Liverpool's transfer policy in those days was they went around and they picked up players from the lower leagues. With one notable exception, they didn't come straight into the team. They would spend maybe a little time in the reserve squad. And it was very different then because if you weren't playing on a Saturday for the first team, then you would go away and you would play for the reserve team. There were only 12 players in those days, 11 on the field and a sub. So so they wanted the players to play, and if you weren't playing for the first team, then you played for the reserves. So I picked out four players from the earlier era, and then there's one player who is more recently what I would classify as a budget signing, and I'll quickly go through them all. So it was Ray Clements. We talked about him, about my all-time team. I think he's the finest goalkeeper that Liverpool have ever had, and they've had some good ones. And he was picked up from Scunthorpe United, who were a fourth division team, and he spent a good couple of years in the reserves. Maybe played the odd game here and there before eventually, after Liverpool's defeat in the FA Cup to Watford, a lower level team back in 1970, he was then promoted over Tommy Lawrence into the first team. And so he is a classic example of what I'm talking about. Another one that kind of comes into that category, although in the later decade, is Alan Hansen.
Hmm.
And Liverpool have always had a connection with Scottish players. And certainly through this era, they would go to Scotland and they would pick up players. From the early days of Bill Shankly, there was Ian St. John and there was Ron Yates. And he built a team around them. Alan Hansen came from Partick Thistle. And again, he served a little bit of an apprenticeship. But once he came through, again, like Clements, actually, he was another one that was in my old time Liverpool team.
Right. I was just going to say that. Yeah.
And actually, the third one that I'm going to pick out as well was also in my old time team, and that was Ian Rush. He was signed from nearby Chester, fourth division team, and he was very close, in fact, to leaving Liverpool because he didn't play for a while, and actually went to see the manager Bob Paisley and basically wanted to get transferred. Uh, but of course that didn't happen, as we all know, and he went on to become Liverpool's record goal scorer. And there's lots of interesting cases like this, players similar to this. Not all of them made it at Anfield, and you even got a player like Steve Highway. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that name. Steve Highway actually was working for Liverpool up until fairly recently. He was in charge of their academy. They actually signed him from a non-league team, Skelmersdale United. The fourth one, though, that I'm going to pick out from this era that comes into this category, who went straight into the first team, wasn't expected, is Kevin Keegan. And Kevin Keegan, he also came from Scunthorpe United, like Ray Clements. I remember he was signed the week of 1971. Liverpool were building up to the cup final against Arsenal. And he was signed early that week and obviously wasn't going to be involved in the cup final, but went into pre-season for the following year, or should I say soccer season. And it was a couple of days before the opening game of the season against Nottingham Forest. And back in that era, it was very common for the first team to play against the reserves.
Hmm.
And this was kind of the last hurrah before the season began. Keegan was playing for the reserves, and he absolutely stood out, caused a lot of problems to the Liverpool defenders, first team defenders, and I believe Shankly just went up to him after it was over the practice game and said, "Do you want to play for the first team Saturday?" I think he was looking to see what the reaction was. Keegan said yes. Keegan was in. I was at that game. He scored in the first 10 minutes.
Oh, wow.
So it was a bit of a lucky goal, actually. He'd already been heavily involved in the game because he was kind of high energy. The ball was crossed and he's running in and it kind of hit him on the shins and it went in. But I'd say even on those 10 minutes that he deserved the luck there because he was let's say he was involved. He was involved. So there's four players and the only player that I can think of in recent memory that comes into that category perhaps would be Andy Robertson,
Hmm.
who was signed for about 8 million, but actually was signed really for nothing because they sent a reserve player the other way to Hull City. And Robertson didn't go straight into the first team, had a little bit of an apprenticeship. And then once he got his chance, he never looked back. So I don't think these budget signings are as part of the equation for the top teams now as they used to be. But that was definitely a way that Liverpool used to do their business in the 70s and the 60s under Shankly and Bob Paisley.
Yeah. And I did a lot of my numbers in dollars. Um, I just kind of did the conversion rates, and Robertson went for 9.7 million. And I mean, you think about that number for a guy that is also on your all-time team. I mean, that is nothing. And Coach, you mentioned Ian Rush, and when I was looking him up, it seems like he went to Juventus, and then we re-signed him for 3.2 million.
Well, that was
Is
further
that?
in his story. That was further in his story.
Yeah, that was
What
down the road. Yeah.
what happened was he had maybe a good 5 years or so, a good 5 years or so playing for the first team. And back in those days, the big money league was in Italy,
Hmm.
and a lot of Italian clubs were chasing him, and he ended up going to Juventus for a year. And actually, he did score quite a few goals, but he never kind of perfectly settled. And actually, one interesting story about that was I was I was back in the UK, and I was going to visit a friend over in Norway, and I was at Manchester Airport, and the person right in front of me in line checking in was Ian Rush. He wasn't going to Norway, but he was off to Italy. And I just remember standing behind him that he didn't look happy at all.
Mm.
And then a couple of days later in the papers, it turned out he'd been fined for coming back late from kind of the Christmas holidays. And as I say, he was standing there in line. He didn't look happy. And so he never totally settled out in Italy. And he was there for a year, and then he came back to Liverpool.
Yeah. So my I'm gonna mention a couple here. The My approach was on some of these was what who kind of got bought and then potentially sold and changed Liverpool, or just got better players, or more impactful players for a team that was on the rise. And the first one I think is pretty clear. Coutinho was bought from Inter Milan for $10.8 million, and we flipped him in 2018 to Barcelona for 133.25 million, with incentives taking it up to 180 million, which in turn landed us Virgil van Dijk for 91 million from Southampton, and then 60 Allison 67.1 million from Roma. One was in January. Van Dijk was in January, and then Allison came the next summer. And Coutinho was a really good player, and we've mentioned this in the past that Klopp mentioned to him that if you stay here, they will build a statue for you if you win here. And I can see kind of how Coutinho's mind could be caught in two places about, well, hey, I get a chance to go play with um, Lionel Messi, and Barcelona back then were just, I mean, unbelievable. They were the best team in the world. I think it's really hard to state that they weren't, especially when Messi was just at his peaks. And but also wanting to stay at Liverpool, a club that kind of resurrected his career from Inter Milan, and they were on the rise, and the coach was a good coach, obviously Jurgen Klopp. So I can see how Coutinho, I mean, you could flip a coin and say, "Ugh, I don't know what to do here." He did end up pushing his way to Barcelona, which I think is understandable. But also the amount of money we got for him, and the two players that we got Virgil van Dijk, who's again on the all-time team as a central defender, and then Allison, who I don't know where you have him ranked, coach, as far as goalkeepers at Liverpool. I think second after Clemens,
Second, I
right?
would
Yeah,
say, yeah.
yeah. So the that was really good business. And although those numbers seem mind-boggling, um, their performance showed that they were actually a bargain. The other one that I thought was really interesting was Fernando Torres, bought for $41 million in 2007 from Atletico Madrid. And he had, many very good years. He was a great player, but when he got enamored by Chelsea and we flipped him to Chelsea for 63.5 million, we got Andy Carroll and Luis Suarez. And Luis Suarez we bought, excuse me, for 28.5 million in 2011 from Ajax, and then flipped him to Barca for 88 million. So there's like all these things that are interconnected, especially with some of the great Liverpool players that ended up leaving, and the amount of money we got and what we were able to turn that into. So those were the ones that stood out to me. But Mo Salah for 45 million in 2017 from Roma. I mean, bargain, especially the fact that he went to Chelsea and he didn't really get a shot because that team was loaded with Lampard and I think Robin was there and Terry. I mean that team was very very good under Jose Mourinho, and the fact he didn't get a sniff. Same thing with De Bruyne. He ended up going to City after playing in Wolfsburg and being very 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 good. And Mo Salah was just shredding the Italian league, and we got him for 45 million. And I mean, again, a guy that is on the reserve on our all time team, and that's hard to believe. Some people might think that's really hard that he's not starting, but when we have Rush, Dalglish, and Suarez up there, it's kind of hard.
Mm-hmm.
The coach, the which one of those stands out to you from the standpoint that I took it?
Well, I think one thing that you've kind of touched on, which I find interesting, is some of these players leaving the club. Um, top players for Liverpool, and then they move on to other clubs. Usually, when they're in a good place in their career, and this has been a recurring theme over the years that I followed Liverpool, even though they've been very successful. Um, you if you're going to measure it by trophies, they are the most successful English club. If you're going to look at it in terms of Champions Leagues, European Cups, I think they rank third, and that's
Correct.
in Europe.
Hmm.
So, like, they've been very successful. But if you go back, I mentioned Ray Clements before. Kevin Keegan was the same. Like he moved from Liverpool when he was at his peak. Graham Souness. And so there's this constant thread going through to the more modern era where you've got um, Felipe Coutinho, who you mentioned earlier. There was Xavi Alonso,
Hmm.
uh, Torres, who you mentioned,
Hmm.
Suarez. So all these players have kind of moved on from Liverpool, even though they were successful. And some of the latter ones that you mentioned are interesting because Mo Salah, for example, Mo Salah is a player that's constantly linked with moving on from the Reds, and maybe this summer he will. I don't know if he'll go to a top team though, because of where he's at in his career. He's obviously moving towards the twilight of his career. But I think that you've highlighted the way that Liverpool does business in the modern era, and I think you've highlighted players who are not just impact players, but they had a significant story in the Liverpool team of that particular era.
Hmm.
And I can think of several players because the nature of maybe transfers has changed over the years, where the fans have expectations, they want the big name coming in. Not sure that Liverpool have ever been that kind of a club, mind you, but I think they showed last year that they were prepared to splash the cash, as they say, when they tried to sign Casido from Brighton Hove Albion.
Yeah.
And the irony is on that particular occasion it didn't pan out, and that's the only time that I can ever really remember them. Uh, especially because they hadn't sold a player like a Coutinho or a Suarez going in with that amount of money to try and spend on an individual player.
Hmm.
And some of the players that I kind of identified over the years that had an impact on the club, I kind of relate it a little bit to who was the manager at that time. And so, for example, when it was Gerard Houllier, I don't think it was the biggest money signing that he made, but Sami Hifia was a significant signing. He went on to captain the club. and played several hundred games and was a dominant central defender for the team.
Hmm.
With Rafa Benitez, obviously there was Torres, but maybe the one that I would pick out would be Xavi Alonso. I'm not sure how much of a reputation that Alonso had before he came to Liverpool. I think Torres was kind of earmarked as an up and coming talent, but some of the big clubs, for whatever reason, weren't keen on it. Well, sorry, weren't keen on him.
Right.
But I think Xabi Alonso came in and was a quality player. Went on to Real Madrid. He was another one that kind of moved on, as it were. I think he was a significant signing, and the other ones that I picked out were Kenny Dalglish and Suarez, as you noted, and he was only there for 3 years, but what a player!
Yeah.
And he had his disciplinary issues, which is why I think that Liverpool, in a sense, were fortunate to get him because a lot of the top clubs balked at the fact that he was always in trouble. And as you'd noted in the previous podcast, had bitten somebody.
Yeah.
so so Liverpool kind of benefited there, and he was a great player for the Reds. Through to Van Dijk and Alisson Becker, they Klopp had Klopp had gone out. He'd brought in players who were very significant in terms of his team plan. Top of the tree would be Salah, as you noted, and Sadio Mane was another one.
Yeah.
And then he brought in Gini Wijnaldum in midfield, players like this, but they had the missing pieces. And you're right, Allison and Van Dijk were big money signings for their position, but it was financed through the sale of Felipe Coutinho, and again, as I said earlier, it kind of reflects the way that Liverpool does their business, or certainly how it's developed under FSG. Because I think the earlier years of FSG, it was kind of characterized by doing some of the things which at the time were unusual in terms of their recruitment. Because I think traditionally, and it still happens to some degree, the manager is always credited with the signings, but I think those days are kind of over now.
Hmm.
I think clubs are run in similar fashion to the American sports, where they recruit players and they give it to the manager or the coach, and then they have to make something of them, or make a team out of the players that they have recruited. Now, it's not totally like that. I think both at Liverpool and Manchester City, where they have top managers, I think that they're given quite a lot of input. But then you look at Chelsea, for example, and you say, well, how much input does the manager have really? Because he, as we both know, they spent a lot of money and brought in a lot of players the last few years since the ownership changed, and well, they just signed another player today, didn't they? So it doesn't deter them from continually signing players.
Yeah. The interesting thing that FSG did in baseball, the Fenway Sports Group, which owns the Boston Red Sox, they did a lot of analytics, which kind of got them over the hump to win a World Series. The first time I think was 2004, and it had been almost like 86 years or something like that. And they took that same approach when they bought Liverpool to kind of start looking at the analytics, but also they were fiscally responsible. That was one thing that you knew, that they talked about it, and it was something that, hey, in order to get a player, we're gonna have to sell one, and they try to make it sustainable, and that's what the difference is between Liverpool and Manchester City and Newcastle and Chelsea. These guys just spend. It's a shiny toy. I would say Manchester United also. They look at the shiniest new toy and they go and buy it without really thinking about um, any fiscal responsibility. And Manchester City has 115 charges. I'm thinking Newcastle's going to have some, and Chelsea will soon as well. But the it worked, and okay, we won one title sandwiched between all of Manchester City's titles, but 97 points and 1 point away from another title, and constantly battling them. And I don't want to call Liverpool like a David versus Goliath story, but when it comes to Liverpool against Manchester City and the resources that are poured into Manchester City, Chelsea, Newcastle, Manchester United, Liverpool is not on that tier when it comes to these crazy financial expenditures, right? It's very, very calculated. They look for players in the margins a little bit. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily call Sadio Mane or um, Mo Salah in the margins, but for 45 million and 44.25 million for Sadio Mane, I mean, that's nothing. And okay, that was almost 8 years ago, 7 years ago, but people were spending big money back then for players. Those figures for those players were absolutely reasonable. And the ones obviously that kind of stood out are Van Dyke and Allison. But again, the sale of Coutinho, like you mentioned, that funded it. So again, fiscally responsible, getting the players you want. And I think one that I'm looking for in the future that I think is going to prove to be great business is McAllister. $45 million from Brighton. You watch him play in the Copa America. He is all over the place. He's unbelievable player. He was great at Brighton 2 years ago. He was very good this year at Liverpool in his first season at a big top club. And I just can only see big bright things for this player in the future. And I think when it's all said and done, we're going to be talking about him as one of the top midfielders in Liverpool history if he doesn't get hurt and if he continues progressing. I think that highly of McAllister.
Hmm. Yes, yeah, yeah. We keep coming back to this how Liverpool does business in the transfer market in the modern era, and the media talks about the big six, and I think that if you look at the so-called big six, you kind of have Manchester City, Chelsea, and Manchester United as the teams that probably have the most financial clout.
Hmm.
Liverpool, I think you're right to say that they have a well documented and expressed fiscal policy. Like they're not going to run them into the ground as the first American owners did.
Right.
So they're responsible from that point of view. And Tottenham and Arsenal, I mean, Arsenal has started to spend a lot more money in the last couple of years, and I'm guessing that probably has something to do with um, they moved the stadium, and they're now in a position where they're generating, they paid off whatever the costs were for the stadium, and they're starting to generate the kind of money in the last year or two, especially as they've tended to do better,
Hmm.
that they can afford to spend more in the transfer market. Tottenham, Tottenham tend to be more frugal. Again, they have a newly built stadium, and I still think that they're paying that off.
You know,
But
you meant
yeah, the
yeah. Go
big
ahead.
six are in two tiers, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny with Tottenham. You always hear Daniel Levy's name brought up, and I mean, it was crickets this year. I didn't hear him in one story about anything, which was kind of interesting. My cousin is a Tottenham fan, and I always give him a hard time about Levy's going to screw it up at some point, but he's stayed out of the news, which is kind of interesting. Anyway, that's a side note. The
Hmm.
Another thing, Coach, analytics, right? Liverpool and Fenway Sports Group brought analytics to to Liverpool. Michael Edwards really took it to another level where he was able to identify players. And, we'll see with Arne Slot if he identified the right coach as well. But he's identifying players using statistics and statistical models which would fit in with a style of play and players, again, that aren't going to cost, aren't the shiny new toy. Uh, that's why the Caicedo thing that you brought up really shocked me when it happened because I was like, wait a second, we have 110 million. Why didn't we go after Jude Bellingham? Although I understand that Jude wanted to go to Real Madrid, but I mean, you watched that guy play. I mean, he saved England a couple days ago with a beautiful goal, and he is a fantastic player. But it's really interesting how now everybody's kind of using these models, and what's going to be the next thing that Liverpool can use that gives them an extra, that 1% advantage over other clubs. So it's really interesting how things are happening and what from analytics to whatever the next thing is to really kind of get an advantage on your opponents. And like you said, you're right. It is top six, but it's really top three and top three, right? And it's cut in half, and you know, I just don't understand how this spending can occur with. I understand that I think they have a 3-year window where they can only lose. I think 105 million is the number that a club can lose in a 3-year window. So we'll see what happens with Chelsea, but the I I love the new signings. It's exciting. We get involved in it. We're like, oh, that would be a great player. Oh, it'd be, but it's just for a little bit, right? And then they have to play, and and some of them don't come through, and some of them do. But I I used to not like that approach that Liverpool has, but now looking at it, obviously 2020, it's been very effective. It's been responsible. It's been looking for margins. I'm very happy with just the way that this has happened and the way we're able to compete throughout Europe, not only in the Premier League, throughout Europe, and obviously Anfield is a stadium that just gets rocking, and everybody from players to managers highlight how important Anfield is to Liverpool as a club. So all these things that I'm kind of talking about, and they all kind of combine to make this Liverpool Football Club and this ownership really understand what's happening and how to move it forward.
Hmm. Right, right. So yeah, I think what's going to be interesting now is in Jurgen Klopp, Liverpool had a manager who kind of understood where FSG was coming from.
Yeah, he never complained about it.
And I guess he'd been in a similar situation before where there was Borussia Dortmund in the Bundesliga, top team, but obviously in the shadow of Moneybags Bayern Munich. And it was to the point that Bayern Munich was taking his players.
Right.
Now, obviously, that didn't happen with Liverpool in terms of players leaving to go to Manchester City or anything like that. If they left, it was to go to the continent. Now you've got a new manager, and so like they have the analytics. Um, Apparently, Arnie Slot has a style of play that has a lot of similarity to Jurgen Klopp. It's not exactly the same. There are some differences. So how how is that going to work with the new manager in terms of the analytics? Are they going to recruit players for him? How much input is he going to have? I think Liverpool have some clear desires, as it were, for the kind of player that they sign in terms of age and the experience that they've had.
Hmm.
And they've always talked about resale value. And I guess that's kind of an insurance policy to a degree. So even if they bring a player in, and not every transfer, as I think you pointed out, works out. So can they get a decent return by moving the player on and getting money back for them? And so what's interesting is Liverpool to date hasn't been active in the transfer market. And I think the fact that the Euros and Copa America are on could well be a factor.
I think so. Yeah.
Are they are they waiting until that concludes before they make their moves? Having said that, I believe that quite a lot of money was spent because of teams trying to get in line with the financial regulations, which ran or for the year ran until the end of last month.
Yeah.
So there's been activity, and the one area where Liverpool might have been involved was Newcastle offered them Anthony Gordon, and reputedly Liverpool were interested in that because he's a local boy and what have you. I'm sure that was a factor besides the kind of player that he is. Um, but part of the deal was that they wanted Jarell Quansah, and they weren't prepared to do that. So that is what the story is that was in the newspapers. I don't know how true that is, but it does appear that Gordon was offered to Liverpool, and whether they continue to have an interest for him in the remainder of the summer remains to be seen, because he's an English player and he's going to be expensive. Um, I think one thing that could factor into this is the rumours about Diaz. Is he going to go to Barcelona?
I just don't see Barcelona doesn't have any money.
Right. Well, that is one of the things that they're talking about is money. So Barcelona has to sell players to buy Diaz. But just say hypothetically, if Diaz goes, then maybe they're prepared to pay more for an Anthony Gordon, for example.
Hmm.
One player that's been bubbling under for a while, and I can't say his name, but he's made an impact at the Euros. Is oh god, I can't even say it. I'll just call him KK.
Hmm.
Kavicia. Oh
For
gosh,
what team?
I can't say it. Georgia.
Oh,
He's
yes,
a
yes, yes. Number
Yeah,
7.
yeah. He's a wide player,
Yes.
and he caught my eye actually when Liverpool played Napoli in the Champions League. He's dynamic. He's very very fast, and so it's been rumored that Liverpool's been eyeing him up for a long time now, because he's had some success at the Euros. Is that going to kind of change the market in terms of other big name clubs taking a more proactive interest in him and being prepared to pay big bucks?
Hmm.
Because I'm not sure that Liverpool are prepared to do that. And you could say, well, Van Dijk and Alisson Becker were top money for their positions. But I think, as we've already pointed out, it was because they'd sold a player for a lot of money, and I don't think Diaz will go to Barcelona or whoever for that amount of money that Coutinho did.
Hmm.
So I think that's interesting. I think the Caicedo situation shows that they do have money to spend, um, and in that case, it was over 100 million that they were prepared to fork out. The other player that's kind of emerged from the Euros that apparently fits the bill for Liverpool is the Italian player Riccardo Calafiore,
Hmm.
central defender, left-sided central defender. And like the Georgian player, I mean, 22, 23 years old. So he's got experience. He's an international. He's young, and he'll have a good resale value if it doesn't work out.
Right.
which is down the road now. Now he's had a good tournament. He missed the game the other day when they were eliminated against Switzerland because he was suspended. But he looks like an impressive player to me, and he's maybe one other player that they've been constantly linked with. Same position is Lille's Lenny Yoro.
Hmm.
He's only 18, but he seems like another Bellingham case in terms of he's a young hotshot, and Real Madrid wants him. So I don't know that he will end up at Anfield, but I suppose Calafiore he might be at a similar level to a Salah and a Mane, like that level signing.
Right.
And I think that is where they're going to spend their money. You mentioned Alexis McAllister. They got McAllister on the cheap, basically, because he
Hmm.
was worth a lot more than that. And I don't know whether it was something in his contract or whatever. But I mean, he was a World Cup winning midfielder. And then we had his teammate with Argentina go to Chelsea for considerably a lot more money than Alexis McAllister. Who was it? Fernandez, is it? So basically, they got McAllister on the cheap, and that's another thing that the FSG look to do is they look around for players that they can get, as it were, good players at a cut price amount, and it does irritate some of the supporters because they're competing with the top clubs, not just in England but in Europe, and they see the big money being spent,
Hmm.
and so kind of the narrative is well, why aren't you spending that money? So yeah, it'll be interesting because just going over some of the things that we've talked about, it seems like the era of the bargain basement player from a lower level coming into the first team, that era's probably gone. And I think Liverpool do tend to bring players in, but it tends to be more at the academy level than it's not really a reserve team anymore like it used to
Hmm.
be. And so there's the big bucks level. And if you actually go through the history of Liverpool Football Club, I don't know that they've ever had a signing which has been like the most expensive or anything like that. I think probably the closest might be Kenny Dalglish in his era. Um,
Darwin was
who I
expensive
think
too.
right, but Darwin, I can't remember what his fee was. Was it like 68 million, but it has the potential to rise to 85 million?
Yeah.
And
85 million. Yeah. Hmm.
and so he's kind of at the lower end of the top tier because the top tier players are going for basically for six figures when it comes down to the
Hmm.
millions. So you have a Jack Grealish, for example, who was 100 million, which I think was a ridiculous amount to pay for him. He's very talented.
Hmm.
I, I don't doubt that, but
Declan Rice, 105 million to Arsenal.
yeah, yeah, for basically a defensive midfielder.
He had a
So,
good year, but that's
oh yes, yeah, Rice is a very good player, but I guess that's how inflated prices are now because typically strikers have gone for the biggest amount of money. Um, but I guess when Rice and then Casido, because he ended up going to
right.
Chelsea, midfielder. So I guess a top striker now has to be what 130 million plus.
I guess. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
yeah, you mentioned the bargain basement is probably gone, and I understand that, but also I think when you look at it from a business perspective, you saw this a lot with Manchester United about 5, 6 years ago. A player would be, say, 20 million. And then Manchester United would be interested, and all of a sudden it was 35 million because it was United and they have money. So,
Mhm.
with the fact that these clubs they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot by offering these crazy prices, but it is what it is, I guess. And Liverpool, unfortunately, is going to be kind of rolled into that, although they don't do that kind of lavish spending. So we'll see.
Well, well, I think it's going to be interesting to see what they do in the transfer market this time around because they have a pretty good squad.
Hmm.
Actually, made that a very good squad. They have a very good squad, but as always, I think it's always an idea to bring in a couple of new players to kind of stimulate the group, as it
Hmm.
were, let them know that there's competition, and if everything's to be believed, they want something a central defender, preferably one that plays on the
Hmm.
left, and I think that if Diaz was to go, they'd look to replace him. Not sure where else they want players. I've heard actually that they've been looking at Anthony Robertson, Robinson,
Right,
not
right,
Robertson,
from Fulham, the American.
from Fulham, and actually he's looked impressive at the Copa
He
America,
did, yeah. He's a good player.
um, and he has a lot of similar characteristics to Andy Robertson. So it'd be interesting to see if they were to buy a player like that, who I don't think is being chased by a lot of clubs, but might tactically fill the bill for what Liverpool are looking for.
Yeah, and you mentioned the transfer market activity that kind of towards the end of June to balance books and all that kind of financial
Hmm.
stuff. The I think when these tournaments end, and they've been very good tournaments, it'll be interesting to see, is it going to have like a World Cup effect when somebody is plays really well at the World Cup, has 3 4 great games, and all of a sudden that price is inflated, or if it's just going to kind of settle down after the tournaments are done and everybody's kind of cooled their heads, and nobody like a Chelsea or those teams that we mentioned, decide to overspend on a player that is a good player but had a great tournament, and then it just kind of resets the
Hmm.
market. So we'll see. I can't see, the transfer the transfer dollars just keep going up and up, and it's just interesting if it's ever going to settle and kind of come back down a little bit. But there's a lot of things in play for that. One thing when we talk about this that I keep thinking back about is when we talked about Manchester City, and if these charges all are hit against them and stick, you know, you mentioned, well, I think they'll probably just go and help the Super League kind of get going, and it's it almost kind of seems inevitable that that these teams are kind of headed in that direction, and I'd probably say Liverpool's probably headed in that direction too. I'm sure the owners would love to have be in a league like that, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, yeah, we'll have to see what happens. But I believe Arnie Slot is going to do his first press conference. I think I read it's at the weekend, and I think one of the questions that he's going to be posed is, "You're going to buy anybody?"
Right.
So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the response is.
Well, Coach, another one down. Liverpool fans, we hope you enjoyed this. Coach always brings us some historical aspects to Liverpool and the topics we choose, which are very informative. And I learned a lot from you, Coach. So I thank you for those. And everybody, we hope you enjoyed it, and we will talk to you next time. Take care, everybody. Liverpool fans, thank you so much for listening to the Liverpool Reaction, an American LFC podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show and would greatly appreciate your support. Please leave a 5-star review and feel free to email us at tlrlfcpodcast@gmail.com. Looking forward to hearing from you. Till next time.